to play the award ceremony music. We're not going to do the awards show this year, mainly because I've heard a couple of podcasts that are doing it now, and I feel like, I did it when it was cool or something. I don't know. Maybe it was never cool. It's actually a Marine band song. Who knew? Who knew the Marines could make something sound like an award show? But we're going to do a more casual version of the end of the year awards show spectacular. And I'm just going to go through a few of the things that sort of made this year special. And we're going to talk about some of the top episodes voted on by you, essentially, through downloads and otherwise. And also a look back on the tours from the year and the exploring that I did. And plus, most importantly, a look back on the goals that I set at the very first episode of 2022. And let's see how I did. All right. So let's start off with the top episodes of 2022. Now, this is in particular order, which goes against brand. Normally I don't, but we're going to go backwards from, these will be, I believe, the top 10 episodes based on downloads and based on input and whatnot. There was some kind of method to this madness. The number 10 was episode number 297, the Empire State Trail preview. There is a little bit of data flow towards episodes that were earlier in the year, but the Empire State Trail preview was something that folks were really, really interested in. And that was reflected by the fact that it was number 10 on the year. Number 9, the only best of to make the list, but it makes the list. Bicycle Tour Food from Best of Pedal Shift 099 comes in at number 9. That's a really interesting one. It might be something worth revisiting in 2023 because if it was that popular, people were that interested. I think eating, as we've joked about on the show a million times, this is essentially a weather podcast and a food podcast with some occasional bicycling thrown in. I think that is reflected in that being number 9. Number 8, episode number 288, a late start on the C&O. This was my one tour on the C&O this year. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. The fact that I wasn't really on the C&O or the Gap at all this year for a big tour really has me thinking about next year. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Let's see, 10, 9, yeah, I should number these, but the next one up is Bicycling New York City. That was a really fun one and was, I think, one of the things that is a theme of 2022 for me was, while I didn't do bigger tours, or as many big tours, well, I certainly did several, I was able to mix in a little bicycle adventure that's kind of touring adjacent, and that New York City adventure was certainly one of them. So that was episode number 286, Bicycling New York City. That was 10, 9, 8, number 7 on our list. Number 6 on our list, speaking of tours, The Missing Link Part 1, which of course was a really grand adventure. And we'll talk about the California trip in a little bit here. That was number 6. Number 6, 5, 4, 3. I think these are all off. I don't think I did 10. Anyways, the next one, this is going to be, I guess, number 4. So renumber all the other ones I said earlier. I should edit that, but nah. Number 4, minimalist packing for a credit card tour. I think that there are more people that do credit card touring than most of us who are kind of in the bike touring, bike packing content game, for lack of a better way of putting it, give credit for. And that's why I think that ended up being the number 4 show of the year. Another fun one, another thing that I'll probably end up revisiting, because I certainly mix in a little bit of credit card touring in all of my adventures. In fact, it typically is my first tour of the year. Spoiler alert, might be happening in 2023 as well. Will be a credit card tour. We'll talk more about that in a few weeks. Number 3, episode 295, Making Your Tent Stealthier. And that was a really fun one, even though it was an utter fail. I do think that it was worth checking out, especially if you are like me and you've got a tent that is not exactly very good for stealth camping. But we learned one very important thing: dyeing your fly, not really going to do much. Go with the paint if that's the way you want to roll, or buy a tent with a fly that actually is stealthy, which is strangely hard. Number 2, our number 2 episode of 2022, Beginner Mistakes, episode number 290. That was another fun one to share. I would love to do another version of that with more of your input. If you've got beginner mistakes, send them my way. Pedalshift@pedalshift.net. I think I would love to help other people learn through our beginner mistakes. I think that was a fun episode. And because there are so many people who are dabbling with bicycle travel, like packing, bike touring, whatever we're doing, from others' mistakes is a big way of doing it. And that's why I think that was the number 2 episode of the year. So what do you think was the number 1 episode? This actually surprised me. I believe this was, in terms of the amalgam of all of the different factors here, the number 1 episode number 292, Touring Bike Essentials. Folks love to talk about their bikes. And I realize I do not talk about bikes an awful lot on this program, but this was the most popular episode of the year. And I think that should tell me something, that signals something to me that I should probably talk about bicycles a little bit more. The interesting thing is that so much of my content that I use in the show is about my actual riding. And I haven't bought a new bike in forever. And so I don't have a ton to talk about. I've really kind of dialed in all of my bikes. There's no new gearing that I'm doing. I'm not swapping out components or doing anything like that. I don't do bicycle reviews, or at least I haven't. So, it's something that I should kind of figure out how to do, because clearly you all are interested in talking about your bicycles. So if you have ideas on how to talk about bicycles that don't involve my 3 bikes, probably a good idea. Let me know. I mean, maybe we could do a series where we talk about everybody else's bikes for a few episodes. I think that might be a good idea. But Touring Bike Essentials, episode number 292, was the top episode of the year. One thing that surprised me with all of that is, although I know that everybody enjoys the content that is about my tours, very few of them actually made the top 10 in terms of the downloads and the various things. That I will say, however, that the popularity of each episode is actually really, really kind of similar to each other. There are very few outliers, pro and con, in terms of all of that. But I did think that it would be a good idea to talk about the tours that I went on this year. We'll start off with the Florida tour, the one that I did in February of 2022. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to the tour journals on that, this was an interesting ride that had a component that was, I think, as interesting to me as anything I've ever done. I started off in Tampa, Florida, as listeners may remember, and I ended up in Walt Disney World. And the key to this trip, although, I had done a trip to Central Florida on a few occasions prior, the really big kind of gamble or experiment, for lack of a better way of putting it, was, could I ride my Brompton from Tampa to Disney World, onto Disney property, to my hotel? I had figured out a route that was reasonably okay, with some big question marks along the way, that would get me to one of the resorts at Walt Disney World. There are very few that are truly safe to bicycle to, because the roads are so highway-like in there, and not even just highway, but big multi-lane highway kind of situation. But there is a route where some of the roads aren't so bad, and I was able to pull that off, and that was really kind of fun and exciting. And I think that I always like to make my Florida trips have a little bit of a different wrinkle, but I'm running out of ideas for this particular route in terms of making it more interesting, doing something a little bit different. So I don't know, I may end up having to come up with another way to make other tours more interesting if I end up doing the Florida route again. But it was a fun trip, and was a really interesting bunch of add-ons that I did to it, including whether or not you could stealth camp in and around Disney property, which is a terrible idea, as I said, and just some otherwise riding around that area, which I thought was kind of interesting. There are very, very few people on bikes in that area for a whole host of very good reasons, but I found it to be reasonably okay. The area in Central Florida around Disney property is changing all the time, and there's all sorts of development. There's all sorts of changes in roads and things like that. And of course, I ran into a road closure as a part of all of that. So lots of really interesting things to learn from that trip, and I really enjoyed it. The next one was in the spring. It was in April, and that was the Missing Link tour in California. And of course, we all know that had consequences all the way down the line. We learned that sometimes you need to make sure you check your tires. Oh, that'll come back again later, because I had a really worn out down tire on the Brompton, and that ended up creating a puncture in San Onofre. I ended up having to huff it. And a consequence of that is I aggravated my plantar fasciitis, which was a theme for the remainder of the year. I'm still not quite 100% on that yet. So that one was a bit of a fail of a tour, although it was a lot of fun. And I did end up, getting the bike repaired, and it did end up cycling across Los Angeles again. I really love cycling in Southern California. These two tours may not be the types of tours for many of you, or especially if you're focused in on bike packing, are going to be much more interested in wildernessy kind of things. But for me, kind of the urban suburban assault tours, they're kind of fun. And I also really like, as we've talked about on past shows as well, the ability to ride in and out of airports and kind of making something a really multimodal thing. Of course, the Missing Link tour had plenty of that. We had trains, we had planes, we had bikes. It was really kind of cool and a lot of fun. And certainly I would like to get back to Southern California again at some point. Next one, a more traditional type of tour, but ended up not doing a whole ton of it. I only ended up doing, I think, the one night on the C&O. And that was fine. This year was not a great year for me to be able to go out for multiple days once we got into the true touring months. And I talked about that on an entire episode of the pod, why I pretty much had a summer off the bike. Injuries, taking care of my partner who had a hip surgery, things like that, just wasn't in the cards for me this year. But I was able to get out on the C&O the one time. Ended up having trees in the way, classic C&O kind of stuff. But I do have to say, the more I have read about other people riding the C&O and the Gap over the course of the last few months, I really miss it. And I really would like to get back and do a more robust version of that trip later on this year, probably. I'm meaning 2023, of course. I'm still, as I'm recording, in 2022. And you're going to hear this in 2022 still. Last but not least was my Empire State Trail trip up in New York. We just wrapped up that, and I had to cut it a little bit short compared to what I wanted to do. But I think what I've left is an exciting and interesting tour that I could potentially do in 2023 to do the north-south version of that particular trail. And, I won't belabor talking about it too much because we literally just finished talking about it on the pod. But boy, I really, really like the Erie Canal Towpath. I think that the integration of that into the Empire State Trail, the improvements they've made in signage, I just think it's fantastic. If you don't catch crazy thunderstorms like I did, you will end up having an incredible, incredible time on that. If it had just been normal rain, I think that it would have been a perfectly great tour, but I just caught I drew some short straws on the weather on that trip, and that's what ended up contributing to cutting it a little bit short. But in any event, that's pretty good. For me, it felt like I barely did any touring this year. But the reality is I did quite a bit of it and a lot of different places. And so that feels pretty good. I think that the fact that I missed out on the West Coast this year outside of the California trip, I didn't get to Oregon, which is a typical thing that I would do, or somewhere in the Pacific Northwest at least. That was missing for me. But, some years you're going to get things and some years you're not. Hello, 2020. One thing that I did do to supplement, as I talked about before, is some of the exploring that I did by bicycle. Some really interesting stuff that I did last winter. I say last winter, I'm talking about the early 2022, the route scouting episodes, and in a lot of ways that kind of just filled in some episodes for me content-wise. But I really actually think that those were kind of good because it got me thinking about different routes. I went back and looked and I was like, oh yeah, I was seriously thinking about Texas Hill Country. And I did do the research on some areas in Pennsylvania and things like that. So I do think that the route scouting episodes were a fun way of doing some exploring from sitting here on my desk chair and also getting out there as well. I may consider doing some of those again this coming winter in early 2023. We'll have to see. I'd be curious what you think about that. And if you have any ideas for any routes that you'd like me to take a look at in my own obsessively planning way. Of course, I mentioned this before, the ride in and around New York City, that was really special to me because I had not ridden in New York City on a bicycle in any real way. I know New York City from way, way, way in the past, in the 90s, basically. That was way before they put in a lot of the infrastructure that's there right now. It's not for everyone. It's very much like Paris in the sense that it's like your bicycle lanes are really narrow and there's a lot of things going on. And there are folks in the bike lanes that maybe shouldn't be in the bike lanes in a variety of different ways. So head on a swivel is the theme, but I definitely enjoyed it. And I do think subway, mass transit, and a bicycle, New York City really shrinks. I always talk about let's shrink the world by bike. Want to shrink the city by bike? New York City is one of those candidates. Pretty fun, pretty interesting times that summer. The one thing that I want to spend the bulk of the time here on this episode, though, is to do something that I hadn't even thought about until I was sitting down kind of planning things out for this end of the year show. And that is to take a look back at the goals from the very first episode of 2022. I set bike touring goals, and I have to be honest. I said, hey, make goals and check back in with them. And I did what so very many of us do is I set goals, and then I pretty much forgot about them within a few months, probably by the middle of the year. And I think one of the things that my partner does, which is really good, it's a happenstance of her birthday. Her birthday is almost exactly in the middle of the year. So she uses her birthday as an opportunity to look back on the goals that she set. So she has a mid-year check-in. And I think that that's something that I'm going to plan on doing as well. But that said, I was pleasantly surprised when I looked back on these goals. So why don't we go through them? The first of those goals was one at least new to me route. And I'm going to give that a check mark on that. Yes, I accomplished that. I didn't do a fully new route, but I hit new sections in two of my routes. The Southern California route, the missing link, it was kind of the whole point. And my New York State route, the Empire State Trail. I did sections in between Buffalo and Rochester that were brand new to me. And I also did a section in the capital region. Also did some stuff that was off the route going to the airport. So I certainly did some new sections. So I'm going to give that I'll give that a full check. I'm going to give myself partial credit on a few others here, but this one I'll give a full check because I did do some new to me routes, even though they were not full new. Okay, here's one. Fitness. Lose the 2021 weight and keep it off. That's a big nope. Full fail. Just a full fail for all sorts of different reasons, including my injury, including the inability to really be on the bike as much during the summer as I would like. That is going to be a rollover goal for 2023. Trust me on that. All right. Let's see. Next one. Revisit a route or a portion of one I've only done once. Well, that's a full check. In fact, we got that in the Southern California area. We've done that in New York State, the Empire State Trail, good chunks of the Erie Canal Trail I revisited, so that was cool. The C&O, of course. But this one says revisit a route or a portion of one I've only done once. Of course, as we know, the C&O I've done multiple times, but I get to check the box because of the missing link and the Erie Canal. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. Next goal was think about a remote work tour option. So in other words, work a little bit, ride a little bit, work a little bit, ride a little bit over a course of a week or 2 or 3 or something like that. Now, while I would say I did, we'll give myself partial credit on this. Goal was think about a remote work tour option. I don't know why I said think about, but clearly I was thinking about at least putting some thought into a planning on that. And I definitely did think about it. But because of the nature of my touring limitations this summer, this just never ended up happening. I essentially have to come into my office 2 days a week is what is sort of expected, but I could probably certainly ask for permission, quote unquote, to be able to do some extended remote work in addition to the days that I usually do work from home. So one of the limitations was that the rules were shifting and changing, and they may still a little bit coming in 2023, but we're going to roll this over, give myself partial credit because I did at least look into it a bit. Okay. Next one, continue to improve my stealth camping skills. Again, I'm going to give myself some partial credit on this. I put a lot of thought into stealth camping and I improved my gear. Several different pieces of my gear, but I didn't pull off any stealth camping at all this year. which is kind of a bummer because I did put so much thought and so much planning into it. So I'll give myself partial credit for improving my skills and improving my gear, but I won't give myself the full check mark because I literally did not do any still camping this year. For the amount of times I talk about it and then the amount of time I put into it, you would think that I would have done it at least once. No, I did not. So partial credit. Next one, repair or replace worn gear. I'm going to give myself a check mark on this one. I replaced a number of worn and repairable worn things. My sleeping pad, my duffel bag that I use for transporting gear on airplanes. It's the thing that I check my gear in. That one, it's still usable, but I bought another one just to make sure because it would be a disaster if that thing ever completely failed. So I have one in waiting for that. And that's a really important piece of gear for me for all of the train and plane transport that I do for my tours when I leave the area and I go to another area to do my touring. So yeah, I'll give myself a full-on check mark there. Certainly more that I could take a look at for other things, but check mark for that goal. Let's see. I've got 2 more. Do I have 2 more? Yes, I have 2 more. Nice bike touring equipment and improved storage. We're going to give that a check mark, but the ink is still pretty wet on that. I am in the midst of reorganizing my cabin storage this week here at the cabin, and that will flow into the stuff that I keep in DC. What I'm doing is I'm expanding the cabinet space that is dedicated to bicycle touring gear so that I can keep it a little more organized rather than just stuffed into one smaller cabinet. It'll allow me to be a little bit more efficient with where things are. And a good idea that I got from Kimberly, my partner, is to have some kind of a catalog of where stuff is, whether I've got a certain type of gear here at the cabin or a certain type of gear back in DC. I think it'll be really smart to have that. There have been multiple occasions where I have wanted to start a tour from DC and thought, oh, I got to make sure I bring stuff from the cabin, and I don't know specifically if it's here until I come back out here. So having some kind of a cataloging system would be a really good way to do that. And I intend to do that. So full check, but more to come on that. And last but not least, episode 300/millionth download celebration. We did that. Check mark. We did our live show on that, and I wanted to thank you all again for being a part of 1 million downloads. We're well past that now, and it was just kind of a fun little thing to be able to celebrate. I am not huge on milestones in my personal life. I think that I do a little bit more of that through the podcast when we have round numbers and things along those lines. But I didn't really think the millionth download was kind of something special. Certainly something that I've never accomplished in any other podcast that I've ever hosted. One I've produced has done quite a lot more than that, but it was kind of fun, and I'm so happy to be able to continue to bring these shows to you. And as long as I still have the capacity to do it, and you all are still interested in listening to it, the Pedal Shift Project lives on. So with that, I want to say thank you all for an amazing 2022. I feel like that 2022 didn't meet my expectations personally in some ways, despite hitting all of these goals. So I really think that I want to try to make 2023 bigger and bolder and do multiple tours all through the year. And so we're going to talk a lot more about what 2023 is going to be like with a brand new goals episode as the first new episode of 2023. Of course, we're going to do a best of to kick off the year like we normally do. And so I hope everybody has a happy, safe, and healthy holiday season. Big shout outs to everybody in Buffalo, Western New York for getting through that storm. Really looking forward to getting past the winter and getting into a new season of touring in 2023. Happy New Year, everyone. We'll see you next year. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community. Expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society.
Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lane, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latois Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grotke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Izuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson,
Sarus Faravar, John Gardner, and Sam Scruggs. And thanks also to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.